Ryu woke up to find himself standing in a world floating among the clouds. Before him stood a calm magician staring at him silently. The magician's first words told him that he had died in an accident, but that was not the end of his story. Michael, the ruler standing before him, had to send Ryu to another world to begin a new life. From the information Michael had, there was no special mission assigned to Ryu. That meant he would be free to live however he wanted in the new world. Ryu quietly said that he only wanted a peaceful and comfortable life. Michael didn't oppose that. He smiled and said it was fine. But first, he needed to give him some basic knowledge about the world he was going to. That world was called Fae. It was ruled by magical power. About 20% of humans could use spells linked to their natural elements. For Ryu, the most compatible element was water. Since he wished for a quiet life, Michael prepared a small egg and some supplies as a start for his new journey. He also gave him a house and a storage filled with food enough for 2 full months so he wouldn't worry about hunger in his first days. Michael also gave him a book describing the monsters he might encounter nearby, so it could help him later when he ventured into the forest. But Ryu, filled with curiosity, wanted to try his new magic right away. He went outside and raised his hand to cast a water spell. Suddenly, a small sphere of water formed in his palm. He was shocked by how easy it felt. Then he realized he could use it just by thinking, without speaking the spell at all. After confirming his magic worked, he went straight to the bath to fill the tub with water. But soon he realized he couldn't enjoy a warm bath, since the water he created was normal and had no heat. He left frustrated and tried to start a fire to warm it. But he didn't know how. He kept trying again and again, but nothing worked. In the end, he lay on his back exhausted, staring at the sun. Then, an idea struck him. He thought to himself that he could try ice magic instead. He filled a bucket with water and focused on drawing out its heat little by little. After a while, ice began to form. After longer practice, he managed to shape it into a lens, which he used to focus sunlight and start a fire. At last, he succeeded in heating the water and enjoying a warm bath. By the end of his first day in the new world, he could finally relax in peace. Through his experiment with ice, he learned he could also create hot water if he increased its heat instead of removing it. He decided to train on that later. The next morning, Ryu sat having breakfast and thinking about his future. Michael had only given him food for 2 months, so he would soon need to go hunting to restock. But he knew one knife wouldn't be enough against the forest's beasts, so he decided to start training offensive magic. The first thing he did was fire a water ball toward a nearby tree. It worked as he expected, but its small size made it useless in real combat. Then an idea came to make it stronger. He formed another water ball, but this time focused all the water into a single point to increase pressure. The idea sounded perfect in his head, but he wasn't trained enough to pour much energy into it, so the result looked like a child's water gun. Ryu then remembered what Michael had told him before his rebirth. Magic depends entirely on imagination. You must clearly picture what you wish to create and keep trying until you master it. From that day on, Ryu trained without rest. After days of constant practice, his water jets became somewhat decent, though still not strong enough to kill a real monster. At least now, he could control temperature. He could enjoy a warm bath whenever he wanted, though he still needed more training to master it fully. The next day, Ryu decided to focus again on ice magic. He went outside and tried this time to create ice directly from the air. It took great effort and many days, but in the end, he succeeded in forming ice from nothing, even if it required 3 or 4 days of non-stop training. Still, he couldn't shape it as easily as water. Even though none of his spells were as strong as he wished, his progress was clear. Ryu never stopped trying. He trained all day until he collapsed, his magic energy completely drained. Each morning, when his power returned, he started again. That became his daily routine for many weeks. After all that training, he could finally form ice in an instant, his first truly useful attack spell. Now that he had mastered his offensive magic and his food supply from Michael was almost gone, Ryu decided to go into the forest for the first time to start hunting. Right away, he noticed animal footprints and followed them until he reached a nearby river. There he found a stone near the water, which could be used to spark a fire when struck with a blade. Since he was already there, he gathered some anti-poison herbs he might need later. Suddenly, a loud growl echoed behind him. He turned quickly to see a small wild boar staring sharply at him. He froze in place from fear. The boar charged toward him at full speed. It was his first time fighting for his life, so he didn't know what to do. Just as the boar was about to hit him, Ryu snapped back to focus and jumped aside to dodge. But the boar didn't stop. Luckily, his instincts returned in time. When the boar rushed again, Ryu formed a sheet of ice beneath it. The boar slipped and crashed hard. In an instant, Ryu summoned several ice spears, ending ending the beast's life immediately. After preparing the boar's meat, Ryo opened the monster book to read about it. He discovered that this small wild boar was actually the weakest creature a beginner could face in that forest, and that his book was only a beginner's guide containing simple descriptions of low-rank monsters. At the end of the book, there were 2 extra pages that seemed extremely important. One spoke about dragons, creatures so powerful they could destroy entire cities alone. The advice was clear: if you ever face a dragon, run immediately. There's no chance of survival, not even of escaping faster than it flies. The best thing you can do is beg it to spare your life. The other page spoke about the demon, but the information was far too little. All the book said was that whoever meets it, meets their certain end. The next day, Ryo went hunting again, unaware of what awaited him. Suddenly, a giant hawk dived from the sky. That hawk could use wind magic, able to tear its prey apart in a single instant. Ryo was forced to flee quickly, forming ice shields to block the deadly attacks. He knew the hawk was a dangerous foe not easily faced, and wished he could avoid the fight. But there was no escape. The only option left was to fight. He raised his hand and fired his water jets, but the hawk dodged them all and swooped down using wind magic in a direct strike. At the last second, Ryo formed an ice shield in front of him. The hawk crashed into it hard, its head slamming into the ground as one eye was pierced. Moments later, the hawk regained its senses, but its eye was completely destroyed. It flew away, and before disappearing, it turned sharply toward Ryo. As if memorizing his face, a grudge had been born. Ryo finally exhaled in relief, still alive after that encounter, but he hadn't expected his peaceful life to be this dangerous. While running from the hawk, he found himself deep inside the forest, far from home. He had lost his way and wandered until midnight. Then, he saw a strange light in the distance. In its center stood a knight, smoke rising from his helmet, his gaze fixed directly on Ryo. As time passed, Ryo continued his daily training. He now knew how to hunt and preserve food easily, and his water magic had advanced greatly. He could form sharp ice blades and drop them with force in an instant. His water jets were now powerful enough to cut solid rock effortlessly. Ryo's combat skills were now impressive, but ice magic wasn't the only thing he trained. Since the appearance of the Headless Knight, Ryo began venturing into the forest every late night to fight him. Strangely, those knights were never mentioned in the monster book. Maybe they weren't monsters at all, or maybe they were far beyond beginner level. Whatever they were, Ryo was determined to fight that knight to the end. He charged forward with his ice staff, swinging it with force, but the battle felt more like training than a real fight. The knight surpassed him in both strength and skill. Even so, Ryo tried with all his might to block the strikes with ice shields, but the result was inevitable. He was defeated in seconds. The knight never spoke to Ryo, yet Ryo somehow felt the knight was acting like a teacher, training him, pushing him to grow stronger. Suddenly, the knight raised his sword and extended its blade using water magic. Ryo froze in shock. Even the knight could use water magic. Then the knight showed him how the water blade worked and calmly handed the sword to him before leaving. Time passed, and Ryo went out hunting as usual. But suddenly, the same deadly hawk appeared again. Yet this time, its feathers were pitch black. Ryo realized the hawk had evolved, perhaps solely for revenge. The hawk dove toward him, unleashing waves of wind sharp as blades. Ryo formed 5 layers of ice shields for defense, but the hawk was far stronger than before. Its wind tore through all the shields instantly. That's when Ryo felt true danger. He dashed left and right, creating ice barriers to block the incoming attacks. At one moment, he found an opening and launched dozens of ice spears at the hawk, but the hawk dodged them all with incredible speed. Sadly, that wasn't the end of the fight. The hawk opened its beak and let out a piercing cry carrying a strange frequency. A wave burst forth, disabling all of Ryo's magic instantly. The ice shields vanished completely, leaving him fully exposed, but the hawk wasn't done. It hovered before him, wings beating heavily. Ryo felt something massive approaching, yet he couldn't tell when it would strike. Moments later, Ryo felt electricity rising around his body. A beam of lightning shot toward him at deadly speed. The strike could have ended his life, but luckily, he used his staff to absorb the lightning and leapt away at the last instant. While still recovering from the shock, the hawk lunged at him, claws ready to tear him apart. At the final moment, Ryo drew his ice sword and blocked the attack with force. The hawk attacked again and again, but thanks to his long training with the knight, Ryo found an opening in its defense and stabbed its neck. The hawk collapsed and hit the ground. Dead, Ryo approached slowly. He understood exactly what his enemy had felt. The hawk had lost its eye because of him and sought revenge. But it never realized that Ryo too had spent all his time training and evolving. In the end, the hawk also lost its fight. Ryo continued his way home, but a shocking sight awaited him. Suddenly, he found himself standing before a massive dragon. He froze, remembering what he'd read about dragons, their power beyond imagination, and that facing one meant certain death. He thought his end had come, but strangely, the dragon spoke through telepathy in a calm voice. It wasn't hostile at all. It said it had been trapped here for a long time and was searching for a black hawk that had passed through this area. It asked if Ryo had seen it. Ryo breathed in relief, realizing he wouldn't be harmed. He quickly understood the dragon meant the hawk he had slain hours earlier. He apologized and explained what happened, that the hawk attacked him and he had to defend himself. The dragon was astonished that a human like Ryo could kill such a creature, yet it didn't seem angry. It seemed impressed. Then its attention turned to the sword in Ryo's hand. The dragon instantly recognized it as belonging to the elf king. It said that meant Ryo had earned the king's respect, for such a sword was given only to the worthy. The dragon's attitude changed completely. It became friendly toward Ryo. The two sat and talked for a long while. Ryo had many questions. He still knew little about the secrets of this new world. Their conversation lasted for hours until the sun began to set. Then suddenly, the dragon ended the talk, saying it must return to its homeland. Ryo thanked it deeply for all the answers. The dragon thanked him as well, saying it hadn't spoken to anyone in many long years. They parted peacefully, each going their own way. At the same time, Michael was reviewing Ryo's records. That's when he noticed something he hadn't before. It turned out Ryo possessed a hidden ability, known as Eternal Youth. Michael was shocked, for he had never seen any being with such a hidden gift since he sent the first girl to that world 100,000 years ago. Meanwhile, on the riverbank, a strange boy with red hair lay motionless on the sand. Who was he, and why was he here? No one knew. The next morning, Ryo went out at dawn to fish by the sea. As he walked along the shore, he found the wreck of a massive ship carried by the waves. He approached it and saw the corpse of a man lying beside it. He checked his pulse. The man was already dead. Then he noticed another man lying on the opposite side of the broken ship. Ryo rushed to him and found he was still alive. Let's go back a little. On that ship there had been many travelers, but a violent storm struck them at sea. In the midst of the storm, a giant sea monster appeared and split the ship in half. Everyone fell into the sea and drowned, but the wreck happened close to the coast, so a few of them made it to shore. Ryo carried the survivor, his name was Abel, back to his house. Afterward, he went out to take care of a few tasks. While he was away, Abel regained consciousness and began to wonder where he was. He stepped outside and saw a beautiful rose garden and a stone path leading into the forest, all carefully arranged by Ryo's own hands. Ryo returned shortly after and was delighted to see Abel safe, even though they had never met before. But Abel was astonished. He hadn't sensed Ryo's presence at all until he appeared, as if he'd materialized out of nowhere. What annoyed him though was how relaxed Ryo seemed, almost too relaxed, as if he were living the role. He almost asked if Ryo didn't own any clothes to wear, but decided to hold back so as not to give a bad impression on their first meeting. Abel politely introduced himself and thanked Ryo for saving him, but Ryo smiled and said he didn't deserve thanks. All he did was carry him home. Then came the bad news. Everyone on the ship had died, but Abel didn't show sadness. He said they were all smugglers anyway, so there was no need to mourn them. Before he could continue, his stomach growled loudly from hunger. Ryo laughed and suggested they continue the talk over lunch. During the meal, Ryo asked if Abel didn't have any clothes to wear. Abel simply answered that he couldn't make them himself. He didn't have the threads or fabrics needed. Then Abel smiled and said, "Then why not buy clothes from the nearest town?" But suddenly, Abel remembered that Ryo might not have any money at all. He himself didn't even know where they were exactly. He had only assumed there was a nearby town. Ryo calmly explained the situation. He said there was no town anywhere close to this area, and that was why he had lived alone all this time. Abel asked how he got his food and supplies. Ryo answered that he was a water mage. Abel's eyes widened in surprise. He knew that in the Empire, only half the population could use such magic. That bothered Ryo a little. He had thought himself more special, especially since Michael once told him that only 20% of people possess that ability. But Abel wanted to confirm something else. He asked Ryo to return with him to the ship's site. When they reached the shore, they found no corpses there. Ryo thought the sea had swallowed them, or that monsters had eaten them. He realized that if he hadn't saved Abel, his fate might have been the same. Abel felt deep gratitude. He said that even if they were strangers, he now considered Ryo his true friend. Abel began searching among the ship's wreckage, but couldn't find what he was looking for. His plan changed. He decided to head to the northern city to meet his friends there. He offered Ryo to join him on the journey. Ryo said he would need a guide since he didn't know the road to the city. Abel replied that he himself would be the guide, and they could start the trip tomorrow if Ryo wished. Abel smiled and shook hands with him on the deal. That night, Ryo went into the forest to bid farewell to the life of solitude he had lived and to meet the Headless Knight, the legendary being who had trained him all this time. He told him about his plan to leave tomorrow but promised he would return someday. He spoke to him with sincere emotion, grateful for everything he had learned. Before leaving, he decided to train with him one last time. It was a true duel filled with passion. Both unleashed all their power, and in the end, as expected, the knight stood alone. When it was time to part, the knight gave Ryo a gift, a legendary armor known as the Hero's Set. He said it suited him far better than the shabby look he wore. The next morning, Ryo wore his new armor and set off north with Abel, beginning a new journey and leaving his isolated life behind. On their way, a wild boar attacked them. Abel stepped forward to handle it, though he wasn't skilled in magic. He used swordsmanship, charged forward with incredible speed, and pierced the beast, killing it in one strike. The forest stretched endlessly, so they were forced to camp under a giant tree for the night. While they were preparing to sleep, Ryo felt something moving toward them. He told Abel to stay behind him, but Ryo refused to retreat, sensing enemies closing in from all directions. Abel thought Ryo couldn't use magic without a staff, but was stunned when he saw him summon crystal shards of ice without a chant. Within seconds, he launched them at 4 approaching beasts, defeating them all in mere moments. After the battle ended, Abel asked in shock what kind of magic he had used. Ryo simply replied that it was just water magic. Before they continued on, Ryo summoned water and made it flow so they could drink. Abel said the day had been long and they both needed rest and water. He drank, still uneasy. He noticed the spell Ryo used was completely different from the usual incantations of the Empire, but Ryo said nothing more. He just stayed silent. The two continued their path toward the city. When they neared it, Abel took out a coin and handed it to Ryo to exchange. Ryo felt a surge of joy. It was the first time he had ever held money since coming to this world. Abel explained that there were other similar coins, and that this one belonged to the kingdom of Nightly. The city they were heading to was part of that kingdom. He added that the kingdom consisted of 3 cities, Lune, Hondolo, and Dohei, and they were heading specifically to Lune. As they passed near a cluster of rocks, Abel noticed one of them moving. He rushed toward it, and Ryo followed. They soon realized they had entered the territory of stone golems. The rocks gathered and attacked repeatedly. Abel tried stabbing them with his sword, but they kept regenerating every time. Seeing that, Ryo summoned an ice golem and smashed 2 of the monsters, then repeated the attack until the rest were defeated. The last one lay motionless. They discovered it had fallen on its back, and since stone golems drew power from the earth, once flipped, they lost all their strength. They also noticed a magic core beneath its feet. Abel said it was a true treasure, so they took it as loot and left the area. That night, they lit a fire and talked. They spoke about nullification magic. Abel said he had only ever seen it in Damas. The word Damas sparked excitement in Ryo's eyes. When Abel noticed, he asked if he was interested. Ryo answered with enthusiasm, "Of course." Abel said he was lucky, because the only dungeon in the entire kingdom was located in the city of Lune, their destination. When Ryo insisted on knowing more, Abel asked if he had ever seen dwarves before. Ryo replied that he was lucky again, since Lune had a small group of dwarves famous for their incredible strength. Ryo said he already knew that. Abel was surprised and asked in astonishment, "How did you know that?" Ryo and Abel continued their journey across the mountains. Ryo said that once they crossed that hill, they would find humans there. Abel was surprised by his confidence and asked how he knew that. Ryo remembered that the dragon had told him, but he couldn't explain it in a way Abel would believe, so he simply said, "Forget it." They kept walking, and soon saw a group of dragons devouring the corpse of a giant beast. That confirmed their guess was right. Abel planned to avoid the fight, but Ryo had a different opinion. He said confidently, "We have to fight. If we're going to fight, it's better to start now, while we're on the ground." The two entered battle and managed to win, but suddenly, more dragons appeared flying toward them from the sky. Ryo raised his hand and used his magic to strike them all mid-air, while Abel hurried to collect their magic cores. Abel was thrilled, even feeling excited when more monsters appeared shortly after. They fought together, and when the battle ended, they exchanged glances and smiled. Their teamwork was truly remarkable. They continued on, talking about whether it was wise to face another wyvern. Ryo didn't mind fighting again, but Abel didn't want to take that risk. At last, they reached a northern area, and from afar, they noticed a long road that seemed to lead to a town. Abel studied the surroundings, and when he saw the road stretching east toward a snow-covered mountain, he suggested they head west instead. He seemed familiar with these mountains, but said nothing more to Ryo, only remarking, "If we walk east, we'll reach a town called Kitty. We can rest there." Ryo was delighted by the news and smiled. Finally, "I'll get to sleep on a real bed." They reached the town quickly and entered a restaurant to eat. While sitting, Abel began explaining to Ryo about the Adventurers Guild and advised him to join. He told him the guild card worked like an official ID, allowing entry into any place in the kingdom without restriction. Ryo liked the idea, especially since Abel had to pay a silver coin to the gate guard this time to get them in. Abel added another benefit. Ryo would be able to sell magic stones and monster loot through the guild. Ryo grew even more excited and began seriously considering becoming an adventurer. The food arrived, and Ryo was astonished by its taste. He couldn't believe this world had meals similar to those from his old one. The next morning, they continued their journey and soon arrived at the outskirts of the city of Loon. Their first stop was the city gate. The guard recognized Abel immediately and froze in shock. Rumors had said he'd been missing for a long time. Abel didn't have time to explain everything, so he simply told him that Ryo had saved his life. The guard thanked Ryo warmly and welcomed them both into the city. They went straight to the Adventurers Guild. On the way, Abel explained that a new adventurer usually starts at rank F, but since he was an experienced one, he could vouch for Ryu's abilities, allowing him to begin at rank E or even D. He added, the higher the rank, the harder and more dangerous the missions. They entered the guild, and whispers spread the moment people saw Abel. Everyone was shocked yet overjoyed that he was still alive. Adventurers gathered around, greeting him warmly, while Ryo smiled shyly, never imagining he'd one day be friends with someone so famous. He stepped out of the crowd to avoid being in the way, and decided to walk outside for a bit. There, he met a girl who noticed his strange outfit, and asked if it was the attire of the Elf King. Ryo froze, not even knowing who the Elf King was, but the girl was in a hurry. She apologized before explaining further, saying as she left, I hope we meet again soon. Ryo went back inside. He found Abel finishing his talk with old friends and introducing him to a man named Ryugo. Abel said proudly, this man saved my life. Everyone welcomed Ryo and thanked him sincerely. After things calmed down, Abel took him to the receptionist to register as an adventurer. He asked her to place Ryo in rank D based on his personal recommendation. The receptionist looked stunned and said, are you really from the Scarlet Sword Party? This is the first time one of you has personally vouched for someone. This boy must be something special. She agreed to register him but explained that he'd have to pass a physical test first. Meanwhile, Abel wanted to meet the guild master. The waitress guided them to the meeting room. As soon as Hugh, the guild master, entered, he froze in disbelief when he saw Abel before him. He couldn't believe anyone had crossed the snowy mountains and returned alive. The three sat down to talk, and Hugh asked if this adventure was enough to promote Ryo immediately, since he knew no ordinary person could survive such a journey. Hugh agreed, and said he would officially raise Ryu's rank. But before they could continue the discussion, the door burst open. Another party entered. The rest of Abel's team, including Lin, Ran, and the other members. When Lin saw her leader standing before her, she froze in place, then fell to her knees in shock, unable to believe she was seeing him alive again. Abel stood and greeted his comrades. Smiling, he said, I would have died if not for Ryo. He saved my life. He's the one you should thank. Hugh realized the team had much to discuss, so he excused himself and asked the guild clerk to prepare Ryu's registration papers. He then left the room, giving them privacy. Ryo tried to leave with him, but Abel called out and said there were things they still needed to handle together. He told Ryo to wait for him in the guild after finishing the registration. As they walked, Hugh noticed Ryo looked uneasy about Abel's fame. He explained that the Scarlet Sword Party, led by Abel, was the strongest in the entire kingdom, and everyone had felt their absence when they disappeared. Hugh asked if Ryo would be registered at rank D. He replied, yes. I'm sure Abel is strong, but no one could defeat those monsters without real support. That's why I'm certain Ryo is powerful too. He then handed the documents to another department to complete the process. Nina arrived carrying the files. Hugh left her to finish the registration while he went to handle other guild affairs. Nina smiled and introduced herself. Hello, I'm Nina, the officer in charge of new adventurer registration. She sat down and began asking about his skills and current level. She asked if he had ever entered a dungeon before. When he said no, she explained that the guild held training sessions inside the dungeons once every month and asked if he wanted to join. Ryo eagerly agreed. She told him, the next training will be in 2 days, at 9 in the morning. Ryo was surprised that this world followed such a precise schedule. Nina told him there was a large clock in the city center, then smiled and added, since you don't have a place to stay yet, you can live in the guild hotel for 300 days free after registration. She completed the paperwork and handed him his official registration card. Thus, Ryo finally became a licensed adventurer. When he left the room, he found Hugh talking with Abel. Hugh was happy about his return, but complained that the city had fallen into chaos during his long absence. Ryo rejoined Abel, who said he was heading to collect the money earned from selling the magic cores. But before they left, he added that there was another place they needed to visit. You're the guest of honor today. You can't refuse. They led him to a grand welcome party. They laughed and drank until late at night. The next morning, Ryo felt a little tired. He went with Nina as she showed him his new room. When she opened the door, 2 people were inside, Niels and Eito. They introduced themselves immediately. Nina reminded them about tomorrow's dungeon training and left. Niels started talking excitedly about how beautiful Nina was, but Eito didn't care and went to speak with Ryo instead. The 3 decided to relax and enjoy their stay at the hotel. A short while later, Nina knocked again and entered with a new boy named Ian, a 16-year-old with a calm voice. He said his parents had died, and he'd decided to become an adventurer to support himself. Nina smiled and asked everyone to welcome him, then reminded them once more about tomorrow's dungeon training before leaving. Elsewhere, Abel was talking with his team about Ryo and what he had seen. He told them how Ryo used magic without a staff, how he fought beside him in battle, and how his traits were unlike any ordinary adventurer. Lin was stunned and couldn't believe what she heard, but Abel insisted, "I saw it all with my own eyes." Rhea, one of the members, spoke up. "The only legend said to use magic like that is the Inferno Mage, but everyone believes it's just a rumor. No one has ever seen him." Worry spread among the group. One of them said, "If Ryo is that powerful, he might turn against us, or even join the evil Do Empire." But Abel smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, that's impossible. I saw something different in his eyes. He despises the name of that empire, though he doesn't even know why." Meanwhile, on the other side, Ryo was laughing and joking with his new companions, enjoying the life that had completely changed since his arrival in this world. Days passed quickly. Ryo continued attending dungeon trainings regularly. Each day, he learned something new, until the awaited day arrived. The instructor stood before them and said firmly, "Today's lesson is different. We'll descend into a real dungeon for the first time." Before starting, he asked, "Does anyone have any questions?" Ryo raised his hand and asked, "Is there a way to return to previous floors using transport spells or gates?" The instructor was surprised by the question. "You know about that?" "Yes, such methods exist, but only in the southern dungeons. Here, there are no transport gates." Minutes later, they reached the dungeon gate. The instructor explained that the city of Lune had been built entirely around this dungeon, which lay at its very center. He continued, "Every few years, something we call a monster flood occurs, when the number of monsters inside multiplies, posing danger to the city's inhabitants." They all entered the dungeon's first floor. The instructor said, "This floor is easy, filled only with weak monsters. You can explore freely, but stay close to each other." Ryo and Eamon went together to explore the area. As they moved deeper into the cave, Ryo sensed movement ahead and said calmly, "Get ready, something's coming." The creature appeared, a giant warrior ant. Ryo told Amon, "I'll pin it down. Strike when it's fixed." He cast ice magic, freezing the ant's legs and holding it in place. In the next instant, Amon charged forward and sliced off its head with a single strike. Ryo smiled proudly. "Congratulations. That was your first real battle." Amon felt proud, but Ryo reminded him of one important step. "Don't forget to take the magic stone from inside it before we return." Ryo and his companions returned to the guild hotel late at night. When their friends heard they had succeeded in the training, they threw a small celebration in the hall. Eto was shocked. He never expected them to defeat a warrior ant on their very first dungeon dive, but Amon said humbly, "I didn't do much. Ryo was the one who pinned the monster down." Ryo smiled. "But you struck the final blow, and that deserves credit too." Niels asked eagerly, "So what will you do now that you're official adventurers?" Eamon replied, "I want to return to the dungeon and keep exploring, but I can't imagine going alone." There was clear fear in his voice. Ryo said calmly, "Don't worry, I'll go with you. I was planning to reach the third floor anyway. But finding an ant on the first floor is strange. They told us this level only has bats." Suddenly, Abel's voice came from behind Ryo. "Sometimes the ants dig tunnels from lower floors and reach the surface. So finding one here isn't that unusual." Ryo turned, surprised to see him. He hadn't expected Abel to show up this late at night. Niels and Eto were starstruck. Abel was a well-known hero across the kingdom. Niels stepped forward shyly. "You've always been my hero, Sir Abel." He introduced himself and offered a handshake. Abel smiled warmly and shook his hand. "A word of advice, kid. Don't overwork yourself on any quest. The most important thing is staying alive." Ryo asked, "What are you doing here this late?" Abel laughed. "My team just returned from a long mission. We came to report to the guildmaster." As they talked, another party burst in looking for him. They clearly seemed annoyed. Abel was known for dodging meetings. Oren grabbed him by the shoulder and slung him over his back like a sack, carrying him out of the hall. Ryu watched the scene, barely holding back his laughter. Then suddenly he noticed a strange look from Lin, a sharp stare, almost hostile, though he had never met her before. Rhea turned to her and said firmly, "Stop with those weird looks. Let's go before we're late." Before leaving, Rhea shouted at Lin, "It's rude to stare at people like that." Lin replied, "I couldn't help it. I heard Ryu is an incredibly strong mage, and I wanted to see him myself." Rhea chuckled. "Honestly, I'm curious too." But Abel stepped in confidently. "No need to rush. You'll all see with your own eyes soon what Ryu can really do in battle." The next day, Ryu and Amon went down into the dungeon again. They followed the same plan as before. Ryu freezing the monsters with ice magic, and Eamon finishing them with his sword. After a series of fights, they sat down to rest. Ryu asked, "Where did you learn to fight? Your style looks just like Abel's." Amon wiped sweat from his forehead. "I trained under an old man named Kiro. He studied at a famous sword school in the capital. Maybe the same one Abel trained in. Ryo smiled. Your style is efficient, but you tire too quickly. You should build your endurance. Eamon lowered his head and said quietly, sometimes I feel weak, like I'll never become a real adventurer. Ryo patted his shoulder with an encouraging smile. Nothing comes overnight. Even Abel, though everyone thinks he's invincible, never stopped training for a single day. He practiced even while traveling. That, my friend, is the real difference. Consistency. The next morning, Ryo prepared to go out, but this time, not to the dungeon. He had a completely different plan. For some time, he'd wanted to learn about magical alchemy, so he decided to visit the library to study. When he arrived, he asked the clerk where the alchemy section was. She smiled and guided him to the beginner's wing. The library was unbelievably vast. Ryo spent hours reading with passion, but time was never on his side. It was never enough. He began thinking of buying books so he could read them comfortably at home. While sitting in the city square, he noticed the sky darkening suddenly. He looked up. The sun had vanished completely. Light disappeared. The city was drowned in darkness. He looked around, but everyone was gone. Suddenly, his body screamed danger. His instincts shouted that something terrible was coming. In an instant, a massive blast of fire struck down from the sky. Ryo raised his arms fast, summoning ice shields to block the attack. He barely survived, but his shields shattered completely. Breathing heavily, he looked ahead, and there stood a terrifying figure. A majestic demoness was walking toward him slowly, her eyes blazing with deadly fire. From the first glance, Ryo knew this was no ordinary foe. His instincts screamed the truth loud and clear. Run. The place where Ryo stood was completely strange, a realm that felt like another dimension with no easy way out. The demoness Leonore launched a second burst of fire, but Ryo blocked it again with icy shields. Suddenly, Leonore used wind magic, sending a direct strike toward his heart. It was so fast that he couldn't react in time, but the cloak he wore saved him. It was imbued with magic from the Elf King, absorbing the impact and preventing the blow from piercing his chest. When Leonore saw the cloak, she instantly recognized it as belonging to the Elf King. She wondered silently, what did this human boy do to earn the trust of a king of that level? Then she muttered coldly, no matter, wind and fire failed, so it's time for the old weapon. She drew her shining sword, her intent clear, to cut him in half. Ryo drew his blade as well, and a fierce battle erupted between them. Their speed was nearly equal, but Ryo held a slight advantage. He had once trained under the Headless Knight, a mentor far more relentless than any foe he faced now. Leonore tried to cast a spell, but Ryo was faster, cutting through her incantation before it finished. Their swords clashed again, flames exploding around them. Spotting an opening, Ryo unleashed a barrage of icy shards, binding her in place. But Leonore was no ordinary opponent. She summoned fire magic, melting most of the ice, then raised massive stone walls to block what remained. The rocks weren't strong enough. Ryo exploited the weakness, firing compressed water shots that shattered the barriers and tore through her defenses. He charged forward, ready to land the finishing strike, but as he faced her head-on, he saw her wounds closing rapidly. He thought, she has regeneration. Small injuries won't slow her down. Leonore struck back fiercely, throwing Ryo into a nearby wall. Before she could attack again, she suddenly found herself surrounded by boiling bubbles of water. Each one that touched her skin burned it. She screamed in pain, her flesh searing under the heat. She dove into the stone floor, burying herself to recover. When she rose again, she smiled faintly through the pain. It was the first time she had ever felt real pain from a human. That pain awakened a strange thrill within her. She wanted to keep fighting, but the dimension around them began to collapse. She whispered through heavy breath, "Time's up. How unfortunate." Her figure faded slowly, but she was certain she would meet Ryo again someday, in another battle. When she vanished, Ryo took a deep breath, knowing he still had much to improve. He thought, if it weren't for this magic cloak, there'd be a hole in my chest by now. Though he didn't expect to face Leonore again soon, he decided to return to what he'd planned before the battle, buying the alchemy books he'd missed. He headed to the guild to check his balance, and was shocked to find himself rich. He remembered Abel's words about the magic stones they'd sold. They were worth a fortune. His joy didn't last long. He heard shouting and commotion from the garden behind the building. He ran to see what was happening. There, he found Niels, Eto, and Amon on the ground, badly beaten, surrounded by 5 young men. Niels was yelling angrily at Dan for betraying and attacking them, but Dan sneered. A real adventurer always stays sharp. Your mistake, not mine. It was clear Dan wasn't looking for justice. He just enjoyed humiliating others. Ryo stared at him coldly, saying nothing. He raised his hand, and in an instant, 4 of the men froze solid in ice. Only Dan remained, trembling. Ryo's voice was quiet, but terrifying. Will you run, or keep going? Dan thought Ryo was weak in close combat and charged forward. But Ryo's punch landed first, a single strike that knocked the air from his lungs. Dan collapsed, motionless. When it was over, Ryo approached his friends and handed Ito a healing potion to treat the others. Niels, hurt and embarrassed, muttered softly, "I'm useless. I couldn't do anything." Ryo smiled. "You were running all day with Amon. Of course you're exhausted." Because they were all worn out, Ryo suggested taking a hot bath to calm their nerves. After bathing, Ito healed Ryo's wound with magic. Fortunately, nothing was broken, though the hit he'd taken was heavy. A little deeper, and it would have struck his heart. Ryo said, "The blow was aimed straight at my heart, but at the last moment, it shifted to my shoulder." Even though he'd survived, the pain was still written across his face. Everyone was stunned to hear he'd nearly been defeated. They asked, "Who were you fighting?" Ryo chuckled lightly. "A long story. I'll tell it later. For now, let's rest and get some sleep." Eto and Amon descended once more into the dungeon. After defeating a group of goblin rams on the 5th floor, Niels spoke with concern. "We should head back. Something isn't right. Goblin roamers never appear on this floor." He felt a strange tightness in his chest. "We've earned enough for today. There's no need to take extra risks." It was the right decision. Had they gone deeper, they would have faced a monster far beyond their ability, especially without Ryo, who wasn't there this time to protect them. Meanwhile, Ryo was outside the city. The battle against Leonor made him realize he still had much to improve. At the guild, the boys headed to the front desk to meet Nina and deliver their dungeon report for the day. Nina was surprised by their early return. They usually stayed much longer. Eto placed a small pouch on the counter. "The reason we came back early is this magic stone." Nina examined it closely. Her eyes widened. "This belongs to a goblin roamer. Even stranger, goblins of that kind almost never appeared on the 5th floor." She rushed off to inform the guildmaster, but before leaving, she thanked them for the valuable information they brought. When the guildmaster heard the news, he was stunned. Goblin roamers were known to appear only from the 10th floor and below. If one showed up on the 5th floor, something dangerous was happening deeper inside. He asked his aides, "How many strong parties are currently in Lune?" The answer came quickly. "Only 2 are available now, the Scarlet Sword and the White Brigade." He ordered at once, "Summon them immediately. I want to meet them in person." Minutes later, everyone gathered in the meeting hall. The guildmaster began. "The reason I've called you here is a strange incident in the dungeon. A group of new adventurers spotted a goblin roamer on the 5th floor." Abel raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about this?" The master nodded firmly. "Yes, the information is confirmed and we have proof. That's why I'm assigning both your parties to conduct an urgent investigation. Check the dungeon and report anything unusual." He added, "Each party will receive 100 gold coins in advance and 200 more upon return. But listen carefully. This mission is for investigation, not combat. If you find any sign of a mana surge, withdraw immediately and report to me. I'll close the dungeon gates until reinforcements from the Empire arrive." The guildmaster had already received permission from the regional governor to investigate, but he wanted to assess the danger himself before acting. He asked, "Are you prepared to accept this mission?" Abel and Phelps, representing their teams, agreed without hesitation. The investigation was set to begin the next morning. At the same time, Ryo woke up early. He planned to visit the Northern Library to learn more about magical alchemy, but Ito warned him. The Northern Library only allows entry to those ranked D or higher. Ryo smiled confidently. "That won't stop me." Eamon added, "I heard the restricted books there can only be opened by rank B or above, so you might not reach them yet." Meanwhile, the Scarlet Sword and White Brigade stood at the dungeon gate, ready to begin their mission. Before the guildmaster opened the gate, Abel stopped him, uneasy. "Wait, I have a bad feeling." He asked Lin to use wind magic to scan the 1st floor before entering. Lin closed her eyes and began chanting. Moments later, she gasped, "There are over 100 monsters waiting near the entrance." Everyone froze in shock. That could only mean one thing. The mana flood had already begun. The guildmaster shouted, "Declare an emergency now. Call every adventurer in the city." Chaos turned to swift action. Warriors assembled on the walls, preparing for the coming battle. Moments later, the ground trembled. The dungeon gates cracked open with force, and hundreds of enraged goblins poured out. Archers unleashed volleys of arrows. Mages sent waves of fireballs. It was a battle of endurance. Whenever one fighter fell, another stepped in while the wounded were healed and returned. Their only goal was to hold the line. But as the numbers grew, the guildmaster's worry deepened. The battle was becoming overwhelming. Then, through the chaos, Niels arrived with a group of additional adventurers, carrying bags full of arrows. Hope flickered back into everyone's hearts, but Niels also carried an urgent message from the guildmaster to Abel. Once the lesser goblins are wiped out, the Scarlet Sword and White Brigade will be responsible for facing the leader when it appears. After long hours of battle, almost all the regular goblins had been defeated. Everyone realized the appearance of the leader was imminent. The guildmaster raised his hand and gave the signal. They were to advance and strike together. The warriors leapt from the walls, and Lin used wind magic to soften their fall and land them safely. Unfortunately, a few goblins still lingered below. Abel and Phelps rushed forward, cutting them down before they became a threat. When the field was cleared, a massive creature emerged from the dungeon, the goblin commander. But the shocking surprise was that there weren't one, but 3 commanders at once. Everyone froze in disbelief. 3 commanders meant only one thing: the Goblin King was near. A true catastrophe. The king was stronger than any creature alive. If he reached the surface, the city's destruction would be inevitable. Abel shouted firmly, "No time to wait. Phelps and I will take 2. Ryo and Shin will handle the 3rd. The warriors charged with all their might. Abel fought fiercely, moving swiftly to dodge his enemy's blow, then sliced off its arm in a single strike. Suddenly, he felt a dark surge of power rising from deep within the dungeon. He yelled, "Everyone, get down now!" An instant later, razor winds ripped through the air, splitting all 3 commanders in half at once. Luckily, everyone had hit the ground just in time. That strike would have killed them all. Then, the true culprit revealed himself, the Goblin King. He looked nothing like the others. Massive, fast, and radiating a suffocating aura of power. They all knew at once this would not be an easy fight. Abel and Phelps charged together, trying to wound him before he attacked again. But when Phelps thrust his spear, it bounced back as if striking solid iron. The king's armor was terrifying, completely unpierced. Phelps retreated, unable to break through. Abel, confident and calm, stepped forward. He dodged the king's strike and drove his sword into the creature's chest with full strength. Even so, it wasn't enough. Abel had expected that. He shouted, "Now, Lin, cast it." Lin, who had been storing her energy, released her wind magic at full power. Storm-like bullets of wind blasted from every direction, piercing the king's body again and again until he was torn apart completely. The battle was finally over. When they returned to the guild, everyone celebrated their great victory. Ryo, who came back late, didn't understand what all the noise was about. People were drinking, singing, cheering, while the guildmaster sat buried in paperwork, sending official reports about the monster attack and calculating the rewards for the adventurers who fought. On top of that, he had to prepare for researchers arriving from the royal capital to study the new monsters. Rest was a luxury he didn't have tonight. At the party, Abel explained everything to Ryo about what had happened while he was away at the library. Then Lin approached curiously. "Is it true you can create an ice wall from a long distance?" Ryo smiled. "Yes, I can. The range is about 40 meters, but it wasn't easy. It took a lot of time to master." Lin's eyes widened. "I've never heard of anyone casting magic from that far. Did you invent the spell yourself?" Ryo laughed. "I'll show you later. Honestly, I just make the spell up on the spot and say whatever I like." Just then, Niels burst in shouting, "Hey, Ryo! Hurry up. The food's going to be gone before you eat anything." Ryo laughed and went with them, but Lin stayed behind, stunned. She wondered silently, how can he say any words he wants? And the magic still works. Abel, laughing, explained, "The truth is, Ryo doesn't need an incantation at all. He only says them because they sound cool. He can cast magic without uttering a single word." Lin's amazement deepened. She could only smile in quiet disbelief. The next morning, Miles, Ito, and Eamon went to the guild in search of work, but were shocked to find the mission board completely empty. Ryo passed by and asked curiously, "Weren't you all on a mission? What are you doing here?" They replied, "After yesterday's monster incident, the dungeon's been closed for inspection. No missions are available right now." They wanted any task that could earn them some coin, but most requests had already been taken after the chaos, leaving them with nothing to do. They asked Ryo what he was up to. He smiled calmly. "I'm looking for magic copper ore. I need it for my alchemy experiments." Ito recalled how rare and expensive that material was. "Isn't that extremely pricey?" he asked in disbelief. Ryo nodded. "True. The last shop I checked priced one piece at 50 gold coins, but it's fine. I have enough. I was actually thinking of hiring you 3. Then he added, "How about this? You gather it for me. I'll pay each of you 4 gold coins even if you find nothing. And if you do find the ore, I'll buy it from you for 25 gold coins per piece." All 3 froze in shock. It was the most generous offer they had ever heard. Miles, still doubtful, asked, "You're serious? You'll really pay that much?" Ryo laughed confidently. "Of course, better to pay you half the shop price than spend 50 at a store." The 3 agreed instantly and set off excitedly to hunt for the ore. After they left, Ryo heard commotion outside and went to see what was happening. He saw Dan arguing with a group of knights who were trying to abduct a young girl in broad daylight. The girl screamed and struggled, but one knight gripped her arm harshly. Dan stepped forward, shoved the man away, and freed the girl from his grasp. She ran off terrified, but Dan was now surrounded, alone against 4 armed knights. Their captain drew his sword angrily and stepped forward, only to slip and crash to the ground without warning. Everyone froze, stunned, even the knight himself. When he tried to rise, he slipped again and fell flat before the crowd's eyes. At that moment, Phelps appeared among the onlookers. His eyes widened in disbelief. Knights, symbols of honor, behaving like street thugs. They tried to threaten him, thinking their authority in the city outweighed that of the adventurers. but they had no idea who they faced. Phelps Heinlein wasn't just any adventurer, he was of noble blood. When they heard his full name, they froze like statues. His father, Alex Heinlein, was the former commander of the Royal Knights, and his family still held power that could terrify any soldier. Had Phelps arrived moments earlier, he would have cut them down without hesitation. He looked at them with disdain and said sharply, "You're a disgrace to knighthood. Disappear before I change my mind." The knights fled in silence, too frightened to utter a word. Phelps then turned toward Ryo, who had been watching quietly from afar. But it was clear to him what had happened. He'd heard rumors about Ryo's unusual magic, but seeing it with his own eyes was another matter entirely. To make 4 knights collapse without touching them, that was precision and range, unlike anything he'd ever seen. He told no one what he witnessed, not wanting to cause Ryo any trouble. But deep inside he felt genuine gratitude. The boy had resolved the situation without spilling a drop of blood. That night, Ryo was quietly eating dinner when Abel happened to walk into the restaurant. Surprised to see him alone, Ryo asked, "What are you doing by yourself tonight?" Abel replied, "I heard one of the dungeon investigators arrived in town, an old friend of mine, escorted by several knights, but those knights turned out to be the same scum who tried to kidnap that girl today. I heard they're in the southern district tonight, likely planning more trouble. I'm going to stop them before anyone gets hurt." Ryo nodded silently and followed him into the night. As they walked, they noticed 2 adventurers dressed entirely in black, whispering in low voices. Ryo didn't recognize them. He knew almost every adventurer in the city. Abel muttered, "Could be normal visitors, but since the dungeon's closed, their presence is suspicious." When the 2 men realized they'd been spotted, they backed away suddenly and ran. Ryo and Abel pursued them quietly, following into a dark alley. In the next instant, a sheet of frozen ice crashed down on the fugitives, locking them to the ground, helpless. Ryo smiled faintly. "That was easier than I expected." Then he looked at Abel and added, "But we still don't know what they were planning. Better hand them over to the guards before anyone else gets dragged into this." That night, Phelps walked alone down the quiet street, until the same knights ambushed him from behind. Their captain still burned with anger over what had happened earlier, and he had come seeking revenge. But before they could draw their swords, their bodies suddenly froze in place. They couldn't move an inch, only then realizing too late that it was a trap. Phelps had known all along these men weren't real knights. He had no intention of letting them escape punishment. He signaled to Rhea, who fired her tranquilizing needles, paralyzing them completely. As they stood motionless like statues, Phelps ordered her to unleash fire magic. Flames engulfed their bodies, turning them to ash within seconds, leaving no trace behind. The next morning, the research team from the royal capital arrived. Just as the guildmaster Hugh had feared, they began causing chaos from the very first moment. Their first act was to seize all the city's food supplies, claiming they needed them for their investigation. Worse yet, Cliff, the lead investigator, demanded that Hugh reopen the dungeon and assign adventurers to protect his team inside. Hugh refused sharply. "Have you lost your mind? We still don't know what state the dungeon is in. It could be extremely dangerous." But Cliff looked down on him arrogantly. "I have full authority from the capital," he said. "That means you'll do exactly as I say." The royal advisor quickly stepped in, apologizing to Hugh for Cliff's behavior, and promised that the capital would compensate the city for the confiscated food. Hugh thanked him for his words, but still refused to open the dungeon. Even so, Cliff persisted relentlessly. Finally, Hugh said coldly, "Fine, I'll open it for you. But if anything happens, you'll bear full responsibility. Not me, not the city." At that moment, Cliff realized he'd trapped himself in his own arrogance, but it was far too late to back down. A short while later, Ryo was heading to eat when a small girl ran up to him. "Please," she said quickly, "can you show me the way to the guild?" Though hungry, he agreed to help her. She introduced herself. "My name's Natalie. I came to deliver a message, a request for Abel's team to assist the investigation squad inside the dungeon." Ryo was surprised. Someone had entered already, even though the dungeon was still officially sealed? Abel, hearing this, frowned deeply. Someone must have forced Hugh to open it. That dungeon was closed years ago after a previous monster flood. Back then, an A-rank party was sent to investigate. None of them ever returned, not even the captain. Since then, a strict law was made. Any dungeon that experiences a flood must be shut down immediately. Ryo listened with interest, but his stomach growled loudly. He smiled faintly. "Fascinating story. But I'll need to hear the rest after I eat." He walked off toward the restaurant, while Lin turned to Natalie, intrigued. "Wait, are you really from the Shvarazov family? The ones famous for their legendary water magic?" Natalie nodded. "Yes." Lin, amazed, asked, "Then tell me, have you ever heard of a spell that can create an ice wall from a distance?" Natalie hesitated, puzzled. "I don't think that's even possible." Abel joined in confidently. "Believe me, it is. Ryo can do it. He can form an ice wall from 40 meters away." Then he added seriously, "Take my advice. None of you should ever try to fight Ryo, even by accident. If it happens, surrender immediately. You won't win, even all together. He looked at Natalie and smiled softly. And if you ever need help and can't find any of us, go to Ryo. He'll help you without hesitation. 3 days later, Ryu's friends returned from their mission, carrying 2 pieces of magic copper ore. He paid them 90 gold coins, enough for them to live comfortably for weeks. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, the royal investigation team had reached the 7th floor. But strangely, they hadn't encountered a single monster. They proceeded cautiously until they discovered a strange black square on the wall. No one knew what it was. No one had ever seen anything like it. Cliff, excited beyond reason, saw it as a chance for a historic discovery. He ordered his team to prepare the instruments to send readings back to the surface. But the moment they powered the device and stepped through the black gate, everything went wrong. In an instant, they vanished. All contact was lost. When they opened their eyes, they found themselves in a completely different place. No one was hurt, thankfully, but Cliff and the rest of the team were nowhere to be found. On the other side, Cliff and his team had landed somewhere else, vast green plains stretching endlessly around them. He immediately ordered everyone to start collecting data, convinced that if his theory was right, this gate truly led to another realm. That also meant monsters could appear at any moment. Yet Cliff looked thrilled. To him, this was a golden opportunity to prove his hypothesis, that the monster's origin lay on the 38th floor. If that turned out true, he would become the first to discover a transport gate, a finding worthy of a promotion to section chief. But all of that depended on surviving, for the creatures in this place were far from friendly. Meanwhile, on the surface above, Natalie and the monitoring team were trying to understand what had happened. Suddenly, the tracker blinked to life for just a few seconds, enough to send one brief signal before dying again. Even with that short window, they managed to determine something impossible. The team had somehow been transported to the 40th floor of the dungeon. That made no sense. Only moments ago, they'd been on the 10th. Natalie instantly remembered Abel's warning before they descended. Without hesitation, she ran straight to the library to find Ryo and ask for his help. At the same time, Nina burst into Hugh's office, flustered. Something terrible happened. The team inside the dungeon vanished. There's no contact at all. Dean Christopher is demanding to see you immediately. Hugh shot up in alarm. I'm going now. But listen. Don't tell anyone about this. If the adventurers find out, the city will fall into chaos. Elsewhere, Ryu was in the library, searching for records about eclipses and monster floods. But so far, he'd found nothing useful. He sighed, wishing Sarah were here to help him. Then, to his surprise, he spotted her standing by a nearby bookshelf. Overjoyed, Ryu approached her quickly. I'm looking for archives about eclipses and monster floods, he said, but I don't know where to start. Sarah smiled gently. I know exactly where they are. And I believe the two phenomena are connected. Every recorded flood happens 2 days after an eclipse. That pattern repeats throughout history. After explaining the link between the two events, she added, to be honest, it took me months of research to reach this conclusion. But tell me, Ryu, why are you so interested in this? Ryu tensed slightly. He couldn't tell her the truth, that he had fought a demon in the middle of the city during the last eclipse, so he quickly changed the subject. All right, Sarah, do you know why magic stones change color? She eyed him suspiciously, sensing he was hiding something, but answered anyway. The color depends on the monster's age. The older the creature, the more the stone's hue shifts. Ryu already knew that, but it only deepened his curiosity about the monster floods. According to reports, every stone collected during those events had been completely transparent, meaning those creatures were newborn, not from the deep floors as everyone believed. His shock grew when Sarah told him the same thing had happened in every previous flood. Those stones too had been transparent. He was astonished. He hadn't expected to uncover such precise details here. Sarah spoke candidly. The records are ancient, written on decaying parchment. Most librarians don't even know they exist, but I know where they're kept, if you'd like to see them. Meanwhile, the investigation team still wandered lost in an unfamiliar world. Arthur turned to the researchers. Are the instruments online? One replied. The transmitter's working again. That means the surface team should know our position now. Relief spread through the group. That means rescue's coming. They cheered. But Arthur wasn't convinced. Abel, noticing his expression, asked, What's wrong? Arthur frowned. The air here feels strange, like the atmosphere inside a field barrier. A spell that blocks both physical and magical attacks from entering or leaving. If that's the case, then we're trapped in a sealed domain. Abel's face hardened. Lin, use your detection spell. Tell us what's around us. Lin focused intensely. Moments later, her eyes opened wide. There's a large group of people about half a kilometer away, around 100 individuals. There are 12 other beings with them. I can't identify what they are. The revelation sent a chill through everyone. Still, it was their only lead. They decided to move toward the unknown group. At that very moment, Hugh received an official report. The investigation team had been transported to the 40th floor of the dungeon. He froze in disbelief. Damn it. Even if I gathered every adventurer in this city, no one could reach that depth. And worse, we still don't even know why they were transported. Christopher stepped forward anxiously. In a situation like this, sending more people down would be suicide. All we can do is wait and pray they're still alive. But the truth was far darker. Fire rained down like a storm upon Cliff's team. Some mages managed to raise barriers at the last second, but most were burned alive instantly. Cliff stood frozen in horror. Everything had turned into chaos within moments, and one thing was clear before his eyes. The creatures attacking them perfectly matched the ancient descriptions of demons. If they truly were demons, this was a disaster. A group of adventurers tried to counterattack, but they were shredded to pieces within seconds. Those who survived were incinerated, their bodies turning to ash. When the second investigation unit finally arrived, everyone stopped dead at the sight before them. A massacre beyond imagination. Ryo, upon seeing the creatures, whispered to herself, "They're demons." Then she shouted, "Listen to me. According to the old records, these beings are enemies of mankind. Their power exceeds that of ordinary humans many times over. Defeating them won't be easy." Someone cried out, "But why are demons here at all?" Arthur cut in sharply. Questions later. Save Cliff's team first. He ordered the mages to flank both sides for cover fire. Just as Cliff's group was about to fall, a rain of magic arrows pierced 3 demons in a flash. The mages unleashed every spell they knew, forcing the enemy back for a moment, but there were far too many of them. Abel drew his sword and scanned the battlefield. One demon stood out from the rest, taller, sharper, radiating malice like a storm. "Everyone, behind me!" he commanded. Orin charged ahead, using his barrier magic to carve a path through the flames. They pushed forward until they were face to face with the powerful demon, cutting down its minions as they advanced. Ryo and Lin bombarded the field with continuous spells, slaughtering wave after wave. But soon, Lin collapsed from exhaustion, and Ryo could barely stand. Now, Abel stood alone in the inferno, against 6 demons. Ryo screamed, "Watch out! That one there, he's a demon prince." Abel's blood ran cold. A demon prince, a lesser version of the demon king himself. Only one hero in history had ever slain such a being. Still, he steadied his breath. "I've faced dragons before," he muttered. The fear back then was worse than this. "I can do this." He lunged forward, slicing down 2 demons in a single swing. But the demon prince saw the movement and launched a beam of pure energy straight at Ryo and Lin. Orin leapt in front of them, taking the blast full on. The explosion hurled all 3 aside. Now Abel stood alone before the prince. He tried to convince himself he could win one-on-one, but hope was fading fast. The prince vanished and reappeared in front of him. A kick sent Abel's sword flying across the ground. Still, he remained standing, trembling, but defiant. He knew deep down there was no chance. The difference in power and speed was insurmountable. Then, from the distance, Cliff unleashed a desperate spell. A surge of fire struck the demon prince's back, but it barely left a mark. Worse still, the other demons turned toward Cliff's team, tearing through their magic barriers, burning each man alive one after another. Abel clenched his fists. He had one option left, his forbidden skill. He activated it, a technique that would let him block a fatal blow and counter in the same heartbeat. But the demon prince sensed it before it happened, dodged effortlessly, and sent Abel flying with a crushing strike. He couldn't even stand anymore. The prince walked toward him, sword raised, ready to take his head. Then, a single drop of water fell. A flash of light split the air, and from above, Ryo descended through the collapsing ceiling. Abel's eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. "Ryu, here?" Ryo smiled calmly. "There are a lot of people worried about you up there. Go on, get everyone out. I'll handle the rest." Abel shouted desperately, "Wait, that's a demon prince." But Ryo laughed lightly. "A prince? I fought a demon far stronger than this one. This one looks like a child by comparison." The demons hurled balls of fire toward him, but Ryo answered with a storm of icy spears, walking through the blaze as if it were nothing. In mere seconds, every demon's head hit the ground. The demon prince froze, staring at the corpses of his followers, realizing that Ryo was nothing like the humans he'd faced before. He raised his blade slowly. Ryo smirked. "Well then, let's play a little." He drew his sword, and the true battle began. Rewinding a bit to understand what truly happened, Natalie had been running through the city streets, shouting Ryu's name in panic. When she finally found him, she rushed forward breathlessly. Abel and the others are trapped inside the dungeon. The moment Ryo heard that, he wrapped her in a chariot of ice and sped toward the dungeon entrance at full force. There was no time to waste. On the way, Natalie explained everything that had happened. He realized the situation was dire, yet he was glad she had come to him so quickly. Still, one question lingered in his mind. How had she known exactly where to find him? She answered, Abel told me a few days ago. If anything ever went wrong and I couldn't reach him, I should look for Ryu first. He said you're the one he trusts most. At the dungeon gate, the guards tried to stop him. Ryu froze the path behind them with a towering wall of ice and charged straight inside without hesitation. He remembered what Natalie said. The signal had come from the 40th floor, but there was no time to descend the normal way. He blasted the ground beneath him with torrents of pressurized water, dropping rapidly through each layer until he reached the target depth. The instant he arrived, the demon prince lunged at him in ambush, but his speed was laughably slow. Ryu sidestepped calmly and severed his head with a single strike. Everyone froze where they stood, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. A demon prince? Slain in seconds? But the battle wasn't over. The demon's severed head rose from the ground and reattached itself to its body. It was humiliating for such a being to be shamed like this before mere humans. Ryu realized that regeneration would make the fight more troublesome, but he wasn't worried. Nothing in this place could truly harm him. To make his point clear, he conjured over 200 spears of ice that surrounded the demon from every direction. Before the creature could even react, its body crumbled into dust. The fight was over, permanently. Abel approached, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. Just then, a man stepped forward and introduced himself. I am Arthur, an advisor from the Royal Mage's office. You have my deepest thanks for saving all our lives. Ryu smiled softly. There's no need to thank me. I couldn't just stand by while people were in danger. I only wish I'd arrived sooner. To reduce the number of deaths. Arthur nodded solemnly. This tragedy will be remembered for a long time. Once we recover our mana, we'll gather the fallen and bury them with honor. Abel then asked Ryu to help collect the magic stones from the demon's remains, so they could later sell them and support the families of those who had perished. Ryu agreed, though something about the place unsettled him. Since descending past the 39th floor, he had felt a strange magical barrier around them. But after the demon prince's death, its presence vanished completely. While using his descent spell, he'd sensed something odd near the staircase. He decided they would investigate it once they escaped. For now, their focus was on gathering the stones. Elsewhere, another group, the Heroes Party, had activated the summoning pool to call forth the Demon King. Moments later, a dark gate opened before them, and Leonore stepped out. The hero exclaimed, "Finally, the Queen of Demons!" Leonore blinked in confusion. She didn't see herself that way. She had only come because she sensed a strange burst of energy and wanted to see its source. But when she realized her summoners were humans, and one of them bore the title Hero, her eyes lit up with excitement. She had always longed to face worthy opponents. The hero raised his sword sharply. "I'll fight you." Leonore smiled with quiet confidence, as though savoring the coming challenge. But in the next instant, her expectations collapsed completely. The hero was absurdly weak. She barely swung her sword, and it pierced his chest with ease. She sighed, disappointed, then withdrew the blade and looked at his companions, who stood frozen in terror. Normally, she disliked killing humans, so she appeared behind their mage and spoke calmly, "Gather your comrade and go home. If this is the strength of your hero, none of you would last half a second against me." Then she added gently, "Treat his wounds quickly. I avoided hitting any vital organs. He'll survive, if you hurry." The group nodded frantically, carried their fallen hero, and fled. Leonore walked toward the summoning pool once they were gone, still disappointed that the battle had been so dull. But then her eyes caught the magic stone used for the summoning. Its energy pulsed with rare, ancient power. She smiled faintly. At least that alone made her trip worthwhile. Inside the dungeon, Ryo walked alongside the adventurers toward the staircase leading to the surface. When they reached it, he pointed to the strange stone Arthur had mentioned earlier. It looked like a magic stone, yet Arthur had never seen anything quite like it. He decided to take it with him for study. He placed the stone into his storage pouch, and the group continued upward until they finally emerged to the surface, where Hugh was already preparing the area to treat the wounded. At the same time, Molly was checking on Abel and the others to ensure they were unharmed. Abel thanked her sincerely for fetching Ryu in time. "If you hadn't come when you did," he said, "none of us would have made it out alive." Everything seemed to be under control now. Hugh was relieved that Abel's team had returned safely. Their deaths would have been a disaster for the entire guild. Yet one matter still had to be addressed. Hugh called out sharply, "Ryu, why did you enter the dungeon without permission and ignore the guards?" The question caught Ryu off guard. He immediately apologized for breaking the rules, but Arthur stepped in to defend him. "Calm down, Hugh. If Ryu hadn't rushed in the way he did, none of us would be standing here." Hugh was stunned. He asked Arthur what he meant, but Arthur didn't want to speak in front of everyone, so he suggested they talk privately inside the tent. There, Arthur told him everything that had happened inside. The demons, the demon prince, and the horrifying battle they survived. Hugh was speechless. The appearance of demons, it's insanity, he muttered. The fact that you returned alive at all is a miracle. He sighed heavily. I thought Abel was the one who protected you all. But Arthur explained that even Abel was no match for the demon prince, and would have died if Ryo hadn't appeared at the very last moment. The next day, Ryo was wandering the city when he caught the scent of delicious food in the air. He followed it and discovered a restaurant specializing in curry, and, to his surprise, found Sarah there as well. She looked startled at first, but admitted with a smile that this place served the best curry in the city. They sat together and began eating. During their meal, Sarah asked curiously, "Where are you staying now?" Ryu smiled. "At the guild dorms." Her eyes widened in surprise. The dorms were usually reserved for beginners. Ryu explained that he was still a new adventurer, though he'd been promoted to rank D immediately after registration. Sarah was impressed. Promotions that fast are rare, but it makes sense. You're clearly stronger than you look. When they finished eating, they left together. Ryu asked, "Why don't I ever see you at the guild, even though you're an adventurer?" She replied with a grin. "I have a long-term contract in the royal capital, so I rarely visit the guild here. I'm actually a sword instructor." Since the topic had turned to combat, she offered him a friendly spar for training, and he agreed right away. A short while later, they faced each other in the training yard. Before they began, Ryu asked, "How did you know I fight with a sword, even though I'm a mage?" Sarah smiled. "Your stance and the way you move. It's obvious you don't rely on magic alone." The duel began. Sarah moved with astonishing speed, but Ryu dodged her strike at the last moment and countered swiftly, which lit a spark of excitement in her eyes. "Few people block my first attack," she said, amazed. Even Ryu was impressed by her speed, and she still wasn't fighting at full strength. She grinned. "All right then, now I'll get serious." Blow after blow rained down on him, and though he tried to keep up, he was eventually overwhelmed and defeated. Laughing, Sarah hugged him lightly. "You have incredible talent, Ryu. Very few can stand against me, especially when I use wind magic to enhance my speed." She noticed he hadn't used a single spell during the fight, which made her even more curious about him. She wished they could continue, but apologized, saying she had another training session to attend. The next day, Niels came to Ryu with a request. He explained that his village had sent a hunting contract, and he wanted to take the job himself, but it was ranked D and above. He needed Ryu to join his party so they could accept the quest officially. At first, Ryu wasn't interested in taking any missions. He didn't need the money anyway. But the moment he heard they'd be fighting goblins and skeletons, his mood changed completely. He agreed to join, seeing it as the perfect chance to vent his frustration on some weak monsters. Niels didn't quite understand what he meant, but he was thrilled to have him on the team. They went straight to the guildmaster's office and declared their intent to accept the request. The man approved easily, but warned them sternly, "Be careful. 2 parties have already failed this quest. One ranked A, and the other D." Ryu was surprised. How could parties of those levels lose to mere goblins and skeletons? The guildmaster explained, "The problem isn't the monsters, it's the villagers. They refuse to cooperate with the adventurers. Seems like they just don't like outsiders." With permission granted, they set out immediately. After half a day's travel, they arrived at Niels' home village. The villagers greeted them warmly, with smiles and cheers, which surprised Ryu, who had assumed Niels became an adventurer because he was expelled. Niels laughed. "I caused some trouble in the past, sure, but they didn't throw me out." He led them to the mayor's house, where Bulan, the village chief, lived. When Bulan saw Niels, he was overjoyed. It had been a full year since they last met. He welcomed the team and discussed the mission in detail. Knowing Niels' familiarity with the village customs, he felt reassured leaving the task in their hands. Niels asked worriedly, "Is it true you refused to cooperate with the last groups?" Bulan sighed. "I'll explain. A while ago, skeletons began appearing near the eastern forest. At first, there were few, but they multiplied until the woods were full of them. So I sent a request for help. The first team that came made a huge mistake. They moved the battle into a place they shouldn't have entered." Niels' face tensed. "They went into the eastern forest, didn't they?" Bulan nodded. "Yes, that's why the villagers were furious. Perhaps they overreacted, but blood was spilled in a sacred part of the forest. That made everyone extremely uneasy." That night, Niels hosted Ryu and the others at his home, where they met his younger brother, Niloy, who seemed delighted to see him return with trusted companions. Niloy said confidently, "As long as you're handling this, no one will object. The last party ignored our customs and entered the forest without permission. That's why no one helped them." But Ryu's team was different. They formally asked for permission before starting the hunt. Niels explained that they would first target the goblins during the day, then deal with the skeletons afterward. Before setting out, he asked for a promise that they'd keep what he was about to reveal a secret. Everyone agreed. "There are 2 unique things about this continent," Niels said. "First, our eastern forest houses a guardian beast." The group was shocked. They had no idea the village was protected by such a creature. Ryu was fascinated, even wishing silently that the beast might one day turn hostile, just so he'd have a worthy reason to fight it. Seeing everyone lost in thought, he asked, "And what's the second thing?" Niels smiled. "The temple. But the village elder will tell you that herself. Patient until tomorrow." The next morning, they set off toward the forest, with Bulan guiding them to the last spot where the goblins had been seen. Normally, goblins weren't dangerous, but the issue was that the village children often played nearby. Suddenly, Ryu felt a strange surge of energy. "Goblins approaching," he warned. "About 10 of them." Niels proposed a plan. "Kill them all but leave one alive to lead them to the nest." Ryu agreed. They hid, waiting for the ambush. When the goblins drew near, Ryu unleashed his spell. All but one were frozen solid. The survivor fled in panic, and they chased him to the nest. As he screamed explanations to his tribe, they too turned to ice. In the next second, the last goblin froze as well. The remaining goblins saw the carnage and tried to flee, but Ryu had no intention of letting any escape. He froze them all effortlessly, while Niels and Eamon shattered the statues one by one. Just as they reached the cave entrance, a thunderous noise rumbled from within. They readied their weapons, and a massive goblin general emerged, muscles bulging, aura heavy enough to crush lesser men. But they weren't alone this time. Ryu cast a stronger version of his freezing spell, pinning the general to the ground. "Now Niels, finish it," he said calmly. With a single clean strike, the goblin general fell. Having Ryu on the team felt like cheating, but no one was complaining. What mattered was simple. The goblin general was dead. When they returned to the village, they were soon introduced to the elderly woman who had heard about their victory over the goblin general. She congratulated them but said calmly, "Your work isn't done yet. There's still much to do." Then she asked them to follow her. She would show them the guardian beast herself. Inside the forest cave, Ryu could barely contain his excitement. It would be his first time meeting a guardian beast, but his enthusiasm quickly turned into disappointment. The creature wasn't hostile or terrifying at all. In fact, it radiated calmness and wisdom rather than menace. The beast looked over the group silently, but the moment its eyes met Ryu's, its expression changed completely. It stepped forward slowly and spoke. "My name is Ankosen." Both Niels and Bulan froze in shock. The guardian had never revealed its name to a human before. Ankosen smiled faintly. "I usually don't tell humans my name. They always mispronounce it. But ignoring formalities in front of someone like you would be disrespectful." Ryu was surprised. Why would a guardian beast speak to him with such respect? Sensing his confusion, Ankosen explained, "I am half-elf. Being near you gives me a strange sense of peace, a feeling I can't quite understand." Ryu remembered what Sarah had once said, that even the Elf King himself admired him. He began to suspect there was something about his aura, or perhaps his presence, that drew elves and their kin toward him. He thanked Ankosen for his kind words, but the guardian chuckled softly. "No, young one, I should thank you. Your presence alone makes me feel as if I could live another 1,000 years without burden." They turned the conversation back to their mission. Ankosen explained that around the temple were roughly 30 skeletons, while inside lay a massive one, a guardian corpse that constantly poured out energy to maintain the ancient seal. The plan was simple: clear the outer skeletons first, then Ankosen would break the seal so they could face the giant within. The group advanced toward the shrine. Eto illuminated the path with light magic, purging the undead that blocked their way. Only the giant inside remained. When the doors opened, they froze in awe. Before them stood a true skeletal giant, exactly as Ankosen had described. Ryu handed his frost-coated spear to Amon and Niels, then nodded to Ankosen to release the seal. The giant lunged at them with thunderous steps, but Ryu instantly froze the ground beneath it. The creature slipped and crashed down hard. Niels and Eamon charged, striking without hesitation. The skeleton tried to crawl away, but the icy floor made escape impossible. It fell again, helpless. This was their chance. Niels leapt forward, slashing through its neck in one clean strike. The skull split apart, and the mission was complete. Afterward, they bid farewell to the villagers and began their journey home. Along the road, Niels and Eto talked about how it had already been a full year since they'd become adventurers. That meant their time in the guild dorms was coming to an end. Ryu and Amon, however, still had some time left. Niels and Eto decided to buy a permanent house and asked if the others wanted to live with them. Amon agreed immediately, but Ryu said he needed to think about it. There were still many things he had to consider. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Lune, Hugh asked Abel to represent him in the upcoming magic festival. He normally would have chosen Phelps, but Phelps was buried in his official duties, so Abel had no choice but to accept. Far away in the Empire, it was confirmed that the commander of the Imperial Magic Knights herself would attend the festival, alongside her infamous aide, the Hellfire Sorcerer, a man said to be the strongest mage alive. His power rivaled Ryu's, but his element was fire. Back with Ryu, he was preparing for his journey to Watch. By coincidence, as always, Niels, Eto, and Amon had been assigned to escort the same merchant traveling with him. The trip turned into endless laughter and teasing along the road, the days passing light and easy. When they finally reached Watch, the merchant thanked them warmly. "My business here will last 10 days, he said. After that, I'll need you again for the return trip. Until then, you're free to do whatever you like." Their faces instantly brightened. That meant only one thing. They could attend the festival. They dashed through the lively streets, drawn to the scent of sizzling food, and began trying every dish the vendors offered. The next morning, the Imperial Army arrived in the city of Witch, escorting Princess Fiona herself. Their journey, however, had been delayed. One of the nobles at the front of the convoy had forgotten his identification papers, forcing the guards to verify his status. The process took far too long. Oscar was irritated beyond measure, forced to stand under the blazing sun because of someone else's carelessness, but he endured it in silence. As the carriages rolled again, Doran leaned over and asked, "What's the real reason for this mission, anyway? Officially, we're here for the festival, but that can't be all." Oscar shared his doubt. It made no sense for the king to send both the Grand Commander and Oscar himself just to attend a celebration. He began to suspect that the king had a hidden agenda, perhaps intending to deal with certain nobles discreetly, away from Princess Fiona's sight. The king was notoriously indulgent toward his youngest daughter, not only because she was the youngest, but also because her magical and swordsmanship talents were exceptional for her age. It was possible he simply wanted to shield her from the darker side of politics and power. No one truly knew what went on inside the king's mind, but Oscar believed he might be using this journey as cover to quietly remove those who opposed the royal family. Regardless, Oscar's official duty was simple and absolute: protect Princess Fiona at all costs. That evening, a grand banquet was held in the royal hall of Witch. Prince Conrad and Princess Fiona attended, surrounded by nobles from every corner of the empire. Approaching his sister, Conrad said gently, "I know you dislike these gatherings, but I couldn't just leave you alone here." She smiled faintly. "It's fine. I can endure it." But Conrad could see the fatigue in her face. He sighed and whispered, "Go rest. I'll take care of the rest." It was the best news she'd heard all day. She hurried to her room, and the moment her head touched the pillow, sleep claimed her. Fiona despised these social events with every fiber of her being. Her heart belonged not to noble halls, but to the training grounds, where steel clashed and magic roared. She could never understand how Conrad, still so young, handled diplomacy and conversation with such calm and grace. Though only 3 years apart, he seemed far more mature. She wished she could be like him, but Mary, her personal attendant, always reminded her, "You have your own gifts, Your Highness. No one in the kingdom can match your mastery of sword and spell. That alone is enough reason to hold your head high." The next day, Ryo and his friends continued enjoying the festival. As they wandered through the main street, they noticed the grand parade, and to their surprise, Abel was sitting among the high-ranking guests. He looked visibly nervous, for beside him sat Princess Fiona herself. Ryo stared in disbelief. "Wait, Abel is sitting next to the princess?" Ryo laughed softly. "The guildmaster asked him to represent the guild until Hugh arrives in a few days." She turned her gaze toward the upper seats and immediately sensed something odd. A massive magical barrier surrounded the area, far stronger than anything naturally sustained. It turned out the Witch family owned a rare artifact capable of generating such high-level barriers, though it consumed enormous amounts of energy and money. Ordinarily, it would never be used, but with the imperial family present, it was essential. Any harm to Princess Fiona here could mean war. When Fiona's name was mentioned, Ryo remembered something crucial. She was the supreme commander of the Imperial Magic Corps, and her vice commander was none other than Oscar, the legendary fire sorcerer himself. At the sound of the name, Ryo grinned. "What an intimidating title." He asked Ryo to tell him more about the man. She obliged. "They say Oscar can burn an entire army to ash in a single breath. He once slew a wyvern with a single strike, a feat no mage has ever accomplished, except maybe you." Ryo chuckled lightly, and Ryo added with a wry smile, "If I were you, I'd stay far away from him. Even I wouldn't dare cross his path." But fate had other plans. Barely 10 seconds later, Ryo accidentally bumped into Oscar in the crowded street. He didn't know who the man was, so he quickly apologized and walked off with his friends. Oscar, however, froze in place. Something about that young man felt off, an aura unlike anything he had ever sensed, familiar, yet alien. Before he could dwell on it, Jurgen called out impatiently, "Come on, Oscar, we still have errands to run." Their task was simple: gather food from the street vendors for Princess Fiona. She had nearly begged them to do it. Forced to remain seated on the royal platform throughout the ceremony, she couldn't leave to taste the local festival dishes she adored, so she handed them a long list of her favorite foods. Laughing, Jurgen elbowed him. "Let's move. We've got to get everything on the list before Her Highness returns to the palace. On the other side of the plaza, Abel stood by the platform when he met Prince Conrad. The prince recognized him immediately. He knew this was the adventurer sent in Hugh's place. Yet something about Abel's face felt strangely familiar, and Conrad found himself staring for a few seconds, trying to recall why. Abel assumed it was coincidence and brushed it off with a polite smile, then mentioned Princess Fiona, who had caught his attention the moment she arrived. Conrad joked lightly, but Abel clarified that it wasn't admiration, it was suspicion. Fiona's presence here could only mean that Oscar was nearby as well, and that alone made the situation feel off. After all, the Empire would never send its strongest battle mage to a simple public festival unless something serious was going on. Conrad laughed softly and told him such talk was forbidden, then excused himself and walked away calmly. That night, another grand banquet was held inside the palace. Abel received another invitation to represent the guildmaster, and although he disliked formal events, he attended nonetheless. The only thing that annoyed him was the strict rule: no weapons allowed inside. He convinced himself that the magic barrier surrounding the palace was more than enough protection. An attack was highly unlikely. But in the control room, one of the engineers noticed something strange: a fluctuation in the core crystal powering the barrier. He reached for the comms to call for help, only for a shadowy group to appear behind him. Before he could shout, they struck him down, and within seconds, the barrier collapsed completely. Chaos engulfed the palace. At that same moment, time rewinds. Back to Oscar's childhood. Unlike tragic heroes of legend, his youth was peaceful and warm. He wasn't an orphan, nor was he poor or lonely. He lived quietly in a small village, learning the craft of blacksmithing under the village elder who treated him like a son. His bright hair and innate fire magic made him stand out among the villagers. A boy destined for greatness, still incomplete. Days passed, and Oscar and the blacksmith finished forging a set of finely crafted swords. For the first time, he smiled with genuine pride. A few days later, the villagers went on a great hunt. With Oscar's help, they managed to bring down a massive wild boar pierced by dozens of arrows. The villagers cheered. The young boy had landed his first true shot. That night, the village was alive with laughter, a feast filled with joy and music. But the next morning, the smiles were gone. A band of raiders, over 50 men, had been watching the village for days. Escape was impossible. They had no choice but to fight. By nightfall, every man who could wield a weapon stood at the village walls, waiting. When one of the bandits crept forward to scout, an arrow pierced his back. The battle began. Arrows rained from above, and the raiders retaliated fiercely. Their leader slipped through the forest with inhuman agility, dodging the volleys like a shadow. He vaulted over the wall and cut down the first guard he saw. The nightmare had begun. He opened the gates and the horde poured into the village. Inside one of the homes, Oscar's mother grabbed a spear and stood in front of the door, desperate to protect her son, but the leader disarmed her easily and killed her with a single strike before Oscar's eyes. The boy froze in horror, then anger overtook him. A small fireball burst from his hand, but it barely singed the man's armor. He charged with a sword, managing to cut the raider's arm, but the man slammed him to the floor effortlessly. The bandit laughed coldly and raised his blade to finish him. That moment, Oscar's father burst through the door, saving his son in the nick of time. When he saw his wife's lifeless body, rage consumed him completely. He attacked the leader with everything he had, but the difference in strength was overwhelming. Moments later, his body was riddled with wounds. As they stumbled outside, the raider drove his blade through the man's chest, killing him instantly, before his son's helpless eyes. After that, one of the bandits rushed to the leader, shouting that a pack of wolves was approaching. The leader wanted to finish Oscar off too, but there was no time. He cursed under his breath and ordered his men to withdraw. Oscar stood there motionless, staring at the lifeless bodies of his parents. Moments later, the blacksmith burst in and found him frozen in shock. He told the boy they had to escape immediately. The wolves were coming, but Oscar couldn't see the point of running. His parents were gone. Nothing mattered anymore. The blacksmith grabbed his shoulder firmly. "Surrendering isn't an option," he said. "Your parents wanted to see you live, to see you smile again." There was no more time. He pulled Oscar by the hand and dragged him outside. At the door, the wolves were already waiting. The blacksmith ordered Oscar to run toward the river while he held the beasts back. Oscar refused at first, but the man shouted again, and the boy ran, tears blurring his vision, watching his teacher fight bravely, knowing full well he would die to protect him. Oscar sprinted through the forest, but soon 2 wolves appeared behind him. He had no choice. He threw himself into the river. The current swallowed him. He struggled until his strength failed, then everything went dark. Days later, he awoke in a warm bed in a different village. The mayor, a kind man named Luke, told him they had found him floating in the river. "You've had hard days, boy," he said gently, "but you're safe now." He offered Oscar a place to live and told him he should attend school if he chose to stay. Oscar agreed eagerly. He wanted to learn everything. to become strong enough to protect those he loved. But 6 years later, his world collapsed again. The entire village burned before his eyes. He ran toward the manor, desperate for help, only to find a man standing over Luke's corpse. Oscar drew his sword in fury. Years of training took over. He slashed at the man and cut his face open, but in the next instant, the man struck back, knocking Oscar to the ground and driving a sword straight into his chest. As the pain consumed him, he saw flashes of that first night, his parents' deaths, the fire, the helplessness. The nightmare had returned in full. Oscar survived, but barely. His hair turned white from the trauma, and his heart filled only with vengeance for everyone who had destroyed his life. Back to the present. Before the attack, Oscar sat quietly with his comrades by the food stalls. Everyone else was eating, laughing, but he didn't touch his meal. He wanted to stay alert, ready to protect Fiona if anything happened. His tension seemed strange to the others. The area was guarded by wind barriers, safe, secure, impenetrable, but the truth was the opposite. In an instant, flames erupted everywhere. Screams filled the air. People were slaughtered on all sides. Fiona barely survived the first blast, stunned and unable to comprehend who could possess such overwhelming power. Her first thought was Conrad. She feared he had been caught in the explosion. She searched frantically until she found him, injured but alive. She cast a protective shield around them both and began healing him. Conrad opened his eyes mid-spell, asking her to stop. He thanked her softly, but insisted that danger still surrounded them and she needed to conserve her mana for the fight ahead. He could stand on his own. All around, assassins were cutting down nobles. Conrad realized no one had tried to escape or call for aid, meaning the hall was sealed shut. He asked Fiona if she could contact Oscar. She remembered the emergency signal but hesitated. Using it might expose their location. Conrad said firmly, "We have no choice. We need help." Now, she raised her hand and fired the glowing signal into the sky. When Oscar saw it, he understood instantly. Fiona was in danger. He and his unit sprinted toward the palace. Even Ryo, watching from afar, noticed the flare, but assumed it was part of the festival fireworks. Fiona finally breathed easier. Oscar would come. They only needed to hold out until he arrived. But before relief could settle, a squad of killers rushed them. Conrad summoned earth spikes from beneath the floor, impaling several attackers. Fiona burned the rest with searing flames. Then, out of nowhere, a chant echoed through the air. There was no caster in sight. Conrad yelled, "Shield! Now!" A massive magical strike crashed down. Her barrier barely held. The hidden mage began another incantation, a fusion of fire and earth. Conrad couldn't react in time, but Fiona saw the ground beneath him glow red. She realized what was coming and shoved him away with all her strength. The explosion hit. Moments later, Oscar arrived, just in time to see Fiona's body falling from the cliff. The sight shattered him. The memory of his parents' deaths flashed in his mind. But this time, he refused to lose someone again. He unleashed his full speed, leaping off the edge to save her. Down below, Amon, Niels, and Ito were playing by the water. They saw Fiona falling from the sky. Niels dashed forward and caught her just in time. Moments later, assassins appeared, intending to finish the job, but the trio cut them down swiftly. Seconds later, Oscar landed nearby. From his view, he saw strangers holding Fiona's unconscious body. Rage exploded inside him. He thought they were the attackers. Without hesitation, he unleashed a torrent of fire toward them. Ito barely managed to block it with his strongest barrier spell. The blast was more powerful than anything he had ever faced. Even so, Oscar didn't stop. His eyes burned with fury as he shouted, "Leave Fiona alone! Get away from her, now!" But at that moment, they thought Oscar had gone mad. A raging sorcerer hurling flames without reason. They couldn't simply hand Fiona over. Oscar launched another blazing projectile. Ito poured the last of his strength into his shield, protecting everyone around him. But the relentless strikes broke through. All three were burned and thrown to the ground, barely conscious. Only Amon and Niels remained alert, ready to die protecting Fiona. Oscar gathered energy for one final blow, a blast that would have killed them all, when suddenly Ryo appeared. He raised an enormous wall of ice, blocking the inferno completely. As the others arrived, Ryo stayed calm. He approached Oscar, asking for an explanation rather than attacking. But Oscar ignored him and fired again. Ryo deflected it instantly. That was enough. He understood now. This man had tried to kill his friends without a word of reason. No point in talking. Flaming arrows rained from the sky. Ryo surrounded himself with layers of ice, which astonished Oscar. No one had ever blocked his magic so effortlessly. Oscar took a step back, realizing his power wasn't working, then unleashed a greater spell. A roaring vortex of fire meant to erase everything. Ryo, calm as ever, sealed himself within a sphere of frost, drew his sword, and prepared to fight seriously. Before the battle could escalate further, Abel arrived, shouting for them to stop. He ran between them, pleading with Ryu to stand down before both of them froze the entire area solid. Speaking in the name of the Loon Guild, Abel declared that the 4 men Oscar had attacked were adventurers from Loon and had nothing to do with the palace assault. Oscar hesitated, realizing what he'd done, but Ryu didn't back down. He believed Oscar would have killed his friends without hesitation, and that demanded punishment. Ryu raised his sword coldly, saying he wouldn't mind freezing Fiona herself if that's what it took to avenge them. Oscar's fury exploded. He called down a cataclysmic storm of fire from the heavens, a spell powerful enough to obliterate an army. Ryu countered it flawlessly, his barrier unbroken. For the first time, Oscar faltered. Even his strongest magic had failed. Meanwhile, Ryu was quietly impressed. The man's strength was immense, but he assumed that was the limit of it. He thought the fight was over. He moved to end it quickly, but before his strike landed, someone screamed at him to stop. Killing a royal mage could ignite a war between nations. Abel stepped forward toward Oscar, explaining that he was here under Conrad's command and that Fiona's safety must come first. "What good will death bring?" he asked firmly. Oscar admitted his mistake, confessing he had attacked without thinking. But the apology didn't change Ryu's stance. In his eyes, Oscar still deserved death, pleaded for calm, acknowledging Ryu's anger but begging him to sheath his sword. Ryu asked quietly, "If it were Rya's life at stake, what would you have done?" Abel answered without hesitation, "Rya would never want a war fought for her sake. I'd do what's right, even if it meant letting her go." Ryu listened in silence. Then, with a faint nod, he summoned a cluster of icy spears, sending them toward the ground near Oscar. A warning, not an execution. Abel stepped forward again, shielding Oscar, his voice steady but full of resolve. "I won't let a friend of mine start a war that doesn't need to happen. If I must stand in your way, Ryu, then I'll do it, even if it costs me my life." Ryu was furious, but not enough to kill his friend. He exhaled slowly, lowered his sword, and said he'd let it go, for now. He asked Abel to bring Fiona to Oscar and hand her over safely. He didn't want to see the man again that day. As Ryu walked away, Oscar kept staring after him, realizing that if Abel hadn't stepped in, he would have died for sure. The next morning, Ryu and his companions gathered at the harbor. They were safe and sound, thanks to Rya, who had healed them at Abel's request. Ryu seemed calmer than usual. A short while later, they ran into Abel by chance. He had spent the whole night trying to fix the mess that had happened. The good news, after explaining everything to Fiona and Conrad, both understood that Niels and the others had done nothing wrong. Even Oscar himself had sincerely apologized. Ryu was surprised. He hadn't expected Oscar to admit fault. For the first time, he thought maybe the man wasn't as bad as he'd assumed. When the festival ended, Niels said their duty as guards was complete. But Ryu reminded them quietly, "The mission isn't over until we all return home safely." Days later, back in Loon City, Sarah was on the verge of losing her mind with worry. A week had passed without seeing Ryu, and she couldn't understand why she'd grown so attached to him after knowing him for only a month. An emptiness filled her chest, so she went to her favorite curry restaurant to distract herself. But when she stepped inside, her heart nearly stopped. There he was, Ryu, sitting at a corner table, eating. Joy surged through her, and when Ryu saw her, he waved her over, smiling. He had missed her too, and there was much they needed to talk about. After they ate, Sarah asked him to come with her to the library. She had something to show him. When they arrived, they ran into Abel at the entrance by coincidence. He was surprised to see them together and asked what they were doing. The two laughed and said they were simply spending the day together. Abel wanted to join them, but he was holding a stack of important papers he had to deliver, so he said he'd see them later. Before he left, Ryu called out to him, asking to meet in a few hours. There was something important to discuss. Abel agreed immediately. Later, the two met as planned. Ryu reminded Abel of an old promise. Back when he saved him from the demon prince, Abel had sworn to buy him lunch for a whole week. Both had completely forgotten. So instead of the meals, Ryu asked for a small favor. He told Abel that his friends had decided to leave the guild dorms and live together in a shared house, and that he was thinking of finding a place of his own nearby. Abel blinked in surprise. "Are you sure you want to live alone?" Ryu nodded, explained that he needed privacy for his magical experiments, things he couldn't do around others. He wanted a spacious home with a garden, a quiet place all to himself. He asked Abel to help him find one. Abel thought for a moment, then said there was a large farmhouse on the outskirts of the city that might suit him. When Ryu saw it, he didn't hesitate for a second. "I'll take it," he said. And so, for the first time, Ryu had a home of his own. His new life in Loon City had begun. And that's where our story ends, my friend. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and